We are fed children's stories as if they are soft as clouds, but in reality, these stories are much darker than we'd expect. They were told to children to prepare them for the darker things in life, a warning of the stalker next door, the pedophile who would steal them from their homes, the creatures in the dark woods, and much more. But we are no longer warned with such tales. So today, we will be learning about the true little Cinder Girl, her life full of murder and torture that stretches out for thousands of years. If you didn't already know, the real Cinderella wasn't created by Disney at all, but instead was borrowed from the 1634 story from Pentamerone by Giambattista Basile, who in turn borrowed it from another storyteller. But the first telling of Cinderella goes back centuries, and even so hasn't changed too much, but enough to see a valuable difference. Rhodopis was a Greek girl who was sold into slavery in Egypt. The other slaves would bully her for looking different. Her eyes blue and her skin white was an oddity amongst them. One day she was taking a bath. An eagle swooped in and stole one of her sandals and flew off. The eagle went to Memphis, Egypt, where the pharaoh was holding a court. The eagle dropped the sandal down onto the pharaoh's lap, and immediately the pharaoh thought this must be a sign from the gods. He sent his slaves all over Egypt to look for the owner of the sandal, and when they found Rhodopis in Naucratis, they brought her to the pharaoh where she became his wife. This story starts off much different than all the other Cinder stories, with the unfortunate mother having to abandon her baby, Shakuntala, in the forest. There she was brought up by birds, who brought her into the ashram, like a monastery, in the Himalaya mountains. One day King Dashyanta was hunting when he shot a deer. He rode up and found Shakuntala crying over it, learning that the deer must have been her pet. The king fell in love with her at first sight. He begged her forgiveness for the loss of her deer, and they married. The king had to go back to the city, leaving behind his wife with his ring. While she waited and daydreamed of his return, she accidentally neglected to greet a magician. Angered, the magician cursed her, claiming that the person she dreamt about would forget her altogether. As he was leaving, one of Shakuntala's friends explained to him the reasoning of her distraction, and the magician realized his wrath was exaggerated. He changed the curse so that the person who would forget her would remember her if showed a token of his. Time passed and Dashyanta did not return. Worried, Shakuntala set out to the capital with her foster father. On the way, they crossed a river by a canoe, where Shakuntala ran her fingers through the water. Dusyanta's ring slipped off her finger without her realizing it. Arriving at Dusyanta's court, Shakuntala was hurt when her husband did not recognize her. She tried to remind him that she was his wife, but still, nothing. Humiliated, she returned to the forest with her son, whom was also the king's, and spent days while her son grew older. Her son grew to be strong and made a sport of opening the mouths of tigers and lions to count their teeth. Meanwhile, a fisherman was surprised to find a royal ring in the belly of a fish he had caught. Recognizing the royal seal, he took the ring to the palace, and upon seeing the ring, the king remembered his bride. He immediately set out to find her, and arriving at the ashram, he discovered that she was no longer there. He went searching for her, upon where he came to see a young boy prying open the mouth of a lion. The king greeted the boy and asked for his name. When the boy answered, he realized that this boy was his son. The boy took him to Shakuntala, and thus the family was reunited. Yaxian was the name of the Chinese Cinderella. This story is much like the Disney version with a few tweaked differences. She was forced into servitude by her stepmother after her father and her real mother had passed. She did have animal friends and a fairy godmother, but with those similarities, there are differences. The differences are that her godmother was actually the spirit of one of her ancestors, and he was an elder male, and her animal friend was a large fish that her stepmother killed and fed to her own daughter. The spirit of her ancestor informs Yaxian that the bones of her fish friend will give her the power as much as a genie would. One night, the king had thrown a festival, and Yaxian wanted to go. She wished upon her friend's bones to be well dressed, and went to the festival in a feathered silk dress and a pair of golden slippers. At the festival, she was praised for her beauty, but upon seeing her stepfamily at the party, she ran in fear, thinking they may recognize her, accidentally leaving behind one of her golden shoes. The slipper was brought to the king, whom had never met the girl even at the party. He was intrigued by how small her feet were. which was considered a sign of ideal female beauty back then. He demands that they find the slipper's owner. However, it was Ya Xian who went to the where the shoe was being held and explained to the king of her life, on which he fell for her and made her his wife and queen. In the Pentamerone by Bezalel wrote the story of Cat Cinderella. In this version, Cinderella's father was a prince whose wife had passed away and he remarried. This stepmother was mean, and often Cinderella would cry to her governess who took care of her. The governess convinced the Cinder girl to kill her stepmother by snapping her neck with the lid of a dressing trunk. Before continuing, I read the English version of this tale and didn't see this detail in the pages, but it could have been this particular translation that lacked this information. Anyhow, after her stepmother's death, the governess became the new stepmother, and it didn't take long before Cinderella was banished to the kitchen. Instead of 2 stepsisters, Cinderella had 6, and they became more important to her father than even herself, and soon she was neglected even by him. In this version, her father left and asked each girl what they wanted as a gift when he returned. As they asked for materialistic things, Cinderella asked for guidance by the fairies. He was able to get this when he was trying to return home and was stopped by a fairy, whom told him to visit a cave where he was given a seed. He gave the seed to Cinderella and it grew into a tree almost instantly. The tree was also a fairy sort and would grant her wishes. One night the king of the land had a feast. At the feast he fell in love with Cinderella from afar, whom had gotten there due to her wishes. In order to find her, he had to have another feast, and another. And on the 4th feast, Cinderella lost her shoe. And during the 5th feast, the king ordered that all the girls, servant or not, to come to this feast. Cinderella arrived, but as her normal self, and yet the king was able to recognize her. He had her try on the shoe she had lost, and as it fit, she was crowned queen right in front of everyone. In the Grimm brothers' version, the tales of Cinderella's mother's death was more detailed. She died from the plague and was buried in the graveyard. Cinderella's father did not die either. He did remarry, and her new family was cruel. She did become much like a servant. Her stepsisters stole Cinderella's fine clothes and jewels. They bullied her and made her life hard. They nicknamed her Ashen Puto, which means ash fool. One day her father went to a fair. He asked his daughters what they wanted, and all Cinderella asked for in return was a twig that would knock off his hat. He brought back a hazel twig, and she plants the twig over her mother's grave. She waters it with her tears, and over the years it grows into a glowing hazel tree. One day the king decides to have a festival that will last 3 days. He invites all the beautiful maidens in the land to attend so that he can select a bride for his son, the prince. Cinderella was not allowed to go. Cinderella cries to the tree, and a white bird grants her a wish, dropping down a gold and silver gown with silk slippers. And much like the Disney version, she goes to the feast, the prince and her dance, and she has to leave. She comes back the next day to the continuous feast, but appears in a grander decor. The prince falls in love with her, dances, and she escapes. On the 3rd day, she is dressed even more grander than ever, with slippers of gold. This time, the prince is determined to keep her, and smears the stairway with pitch. When Cinderella runs away, one of her golden slippers sticks to the pitch, and she has to leave it behind. The prince proclaims he will marry the maiden whose foot fits the golden slipper. Oh boy, here we go. When arriving to Cinderella's house, the stepsisters try on the slipper and it doesn't fit. So one cuts off her heel and the other cuts off her big toe in order to make the slipper fit. But he spots the blood drips and is appalled by their treachery. He is then alerted about Cinderella's presence in the house and has her put the slipper on. The prince recognizes her anyhow, and in the end, during her wedding, doves flew down to her stepsister's eyes and plucked them out, leaving them blind for the rest of their lives. From abandonment, neglect, to loss and murder, each story Cinderella plays in, she suffers in some way, whether it's minor or traumatic. Each story tells of a girl who rises to power, of course usually by some magical means. There are many different versions of Cinderella in almost every single country. A few others worth mentioning is Russian Coati from Scotland, Capel Rushes in England, Katie Wooden Cloak from Norway, and the Golden Slipper in Russia. I had misplaced myself when I said the Disney version was based on Basile's version of Cinderella. The 1950s film actually was based off of the French story by Charles Perrault's 1697 adaptation that took out all the gruesome bits and added the magical elements in their place. I hope you enjoyed. If you wish to support me, check out my Patreon. I create videos on cryptids, abductions, hauntings, serious killers, and more. If you can't support me there, please like, comment, and subscribe. I'd like to thank my supporting Patreon thus far.